Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Stu Borman, Contributing Senior Editor at CNEN Media Group, and I will be moderating today's event. This webinar on practical UHPLC, selectivity and rapid method development, method translations, and UHPLC instrument transfers is being sponsored by MacMod Analytical. CNEN works with sponsors to identify topics of interest and value to CNEN's audience, consistent with CNEN's mission to provide news and analysis of the chemistry enterprise in a timely, accurate, and balanced fashion. During the webinar, you can adjust the size of the slides on your screen by grabbing the lower right corner with your mouse. If you need technical assistance, please look at the Help widget at the bottom of the screen or type your query into the Q&A box. If you are disconnected during the webcast, please log in again according to the instructions you received earlier. You are encouraged to contribute to the success of this webinar by asking questions at any time during the presentation through the Q&A box on your screen. The questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, and as your moderator, I will be posing as many as time permits. Please note that CNEN does not endorse any company, products, or services that may be mentioned in the webinars, and that each webinar will be archived at CNEN Online after the live webcast. The presentation today is being sponsored by MacMod Analytical. MacMod's mission statement is Smarter Chromatography. Smarter chromatography means that the company partners with you to recommend HPLC or UHPLC products and to offer innovative solutions to complex problems. MacMod Analytical uses advanced state-of-the-art analytical software to match its product portfolio with your separation needs. It leverages its 30-plus years of experience in the LC column business, its technical expertise, and its manufacturing network to help you solve your toughest application problems. And it provides up-to-date and accurate technical catalogs and reports from industry-leading separation scientists to keep you informed of new technologies. During the presentation today, we will hear from Alan P. McEwen, Business Development Director at Advanced Chromatography Technologies Limited. Alan earned a PhD in analytical chemistry from the University of Nottingham, UK. His postdoctoral studies involved the development of novel stationary phases and their design and chromatographic performance for use in pharmaceutical applications of HPLC, micro-HPLC, and capillary electrochromatography. He began his career at AstraZeneca, UK, where he contributed individually to and supervised drug substance and formulated product delivery projects, chromatographic method development, and separation science technology innovation. Alan then moved to Pfizer UK, where he became team leader for chromatography projects in the Analytical Research and Development Group for Pfizer's small molecule portfolio. He has written and published articles and book chapters on separation science, chromatography, and genotoxic impurities. Alan is a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry and a chartered chemist. I will now hand the mic over to Alan McEwen.
Okay, so thank you very much for that kind introduction and welcome everybody today to this webinar. This is a webinar that is a combination of a couple of different presentations and information that I have around UHPLC. This is titled Practical UHPLC because I hope that it's going to be useful practically to all of you when you're doing your analyses in your lab. I touch on a couple of different topics for this particular webinar, including selectivity and how it can be useful for method development, how we can speed up method development, method translations, that's moving methods between different column dimensions, and also instrument transfers. And that means using the same method but on multiple different vendor instrument platforms. How can we get exactly the same chromatography, the same selectivity, when we move isocratic and gradient methods between different vendor platforms? And there are ways we can do that quantitatively. I'm going to discuss that today. So moving on with the webinar, here are the content of what I will cover today. First of all, of course, how can UHPLC help us? I don't want to go into the theory. That's been done very extensively elsewhere. I only have one slide that frames up why UHPLC can be helpful. I'll talk a bit about ultra-resolution separations, where we can combine multiple columns to improve the resolving power of our methods. And I'll also talk about practical hints and tips, housekeeping, things that can help you for your general UHPLC analytical laboratory. I'll talk a little bit about selectivity, and in particular about mechanisms of interaction for different column chemistries and how they can help you reach the method you're trying to develop more quickly. I'll talk about translating methods to different column formats, moving from HPLC to UHPLC, for instance, but also between different UHPLC platforms in terms of the column dimensions. And then I'll also talk about, once you've developed that UHPLC method you're very happy with, how do we move that method between different instruments, in particular different vendor instruments for isocratic methods and for gradient methods. So, how can UHPLC help us? Well, this is one slide that covers the theory of UHPLC. I'm certainly not going to go through it in detail, but essentially we all know that the number of theoretical plates increases as we reduce the particle size of the silica in our column. So for instance, approximately if we reduce the particle size of our HPLC, of our columns by 3 times, the efficiency increases by around about 3 times. So for instance, moving from a standard 5 micron particle to a 1.7 micron particle should give us approximately 3 times the efficiency of the original separation. Now we can also reduce the column length by around 3 times, and that should give us an also concurrent improvement in the runtime. And so we can see at the bottom of the slide there, for instance, we have a 150 millimeter 5 micron column is approximately equivalent in terms of performance to a 50 millimeter 1.7 micron column. But of course the big difference is the analytical runtime is considerably reduced. So an original 15-minute method will actually be around about 5 minutes. So that's all the theory that I'm going to talk about for UHPLC, but I've got other examples later which describe this in a little bit more detail from a practical perspective. So how can UHPLC help us? There are lots of different benefits and advantages that UHPLC can offer over the traditional HPLC technique. Of course, as I mentioned, there's speed of analysis, there's an improvement in resolution, and there's also ultra high resolution, where we can use the resolving power of the high pressure systems to give us really quite high peak capacities, particularly in gradient analysis. And then of course there's the increased productivity angle as well. So that is the number of samples per unit time, or the time that it takes to develop new methods. So if we look at point 1 and 2 first, which is the speed and higher resolution angle, we can see on the slide here a typical simple separation. This is on a HPLC-based column, 150 by 4.6 millimeter, 5 micron, and this is a gradient analysis, so we're quoting peak capacity values here. And you can see that approximately 25-minute runtime. Now we can translate that method down to a 50 by 3 millimeter 1.7 micron column, and you can see that we benefit from the improvement in speeds. So now we have a method that is under 5 minutes versus a method that was 25 minutes with similar peak capacity values, similar resolving power. So UHPLC is offering us the ability to analyze samples much more quickly. Of course, you can see the pressures are quite different there. So now we have a pressure value of around 500 bar compared to the original HPLC analysis, which was around 80 bar. But also we can use UHPLC in terms of resolution. So instead of having a 50 by 3 millimeter column, we've now translated the method using a 100 by 3 millimeter column. So we have a slightly longer, we have a doubly long column length. Of course, the performance of the separation in terms of resolution is higher. And in fact, if we look at, for instance, the peaks 1 and 2, you can see here that on the original HPLC method, we have resolution value of 7.8. With the UHPLC method at 100 mil, we have a resolution value of 11.1. So there is an obvious increase in the resolving power. And later in the chromatogram, we can see again peaks 8 and 9, the peak pair 8 and 9. We can see original HPLC resolution of 8.2. And then with the 100 by 3 millimeter format, we have a resolution value of 10.3. So UHPLC is offering us the ability to go very fast, or it's offering us the ability to go with improved resolution. Now, how can we use this practically? Well, there's lots of different ways that we can use this, and on the screen now is the analysis of echinacea, and a natural product. And we can see this is using a solid core type column, an ACE Ultra Core Super C18, and you can see some of the conditions for the method on the right-hand side. So this is using a 150 by 3 millimeter column dimension, 2.5 micron particle size. We can see the gradient time is 20 minutes, the flow rate is 0.43 mils per minute, pressure around about 130 bar. Now we can translate this method to a longer column. We can put together 2 columns, so we can have an effective bed length of 300 millimeters. But to do that, we must make sure that the selectivity stays the same. So the equation that's on the screen, Tg1 F1 over Vm1, must equal Tg2 F2 over Vm2. We have to balance both sides of the equation. So if Vm2 is increasing in size, that's the column volume, because we are coupling together 2 columns, then we have to change the gradient time to keep the product of the equation the same. So when we put together 2 columns, we can see now the gradient time has changed. It's now 40 minutes, but we have an effective column length of 300 millimeters. And if we look at the detail of the chromatogram, we can see the resolution value for the peak pair that I picked out in the original single column format was 1.2. In the dual column format, it's now 1.68. We have a higher resolution. And if you look at the peak capacity values, which is the accurate way to measure the number of peaks per unit time in gradient chromatography, we started with 513 and now we're at 682. And of course, we can put another column together. So now we have an effective column length of 450 millimeters. And again, we've got to adjust the equation. We changed Tg because we've increased Vm. And we can see that we have a gradient time of around 60 minutes, so that the selectivity stays exactly the same. The column volume is now 3 times longer. And we can see the resolution of the peaks that I've picked out is 2.06 with a peak capacity of over 900. And if we zoom in to look at the detail of what this has actually done to the chromatography, I've aligned the chromatograms here so we can see the same part of the chromatogram. You can see at the top we have the single column, in the center we have the 2 columns coupled together, and at the bottom we have 3 columns coupled together. And you can see how we're getting increased detail. We're seeing more information with the 3 columns, more peaks have been resolved compared to the single column format. So we're using UHPLC and column translation to get us the improved detail of the smaller peaks that are in this particular sample. What about productivity? How can we improve productivity? Well, at the top chromatogram here is the HPLC separation. This is for some peptides, gradient analysis, and we can see here that at the bottom chromatogram, we've accurately translated that method to a UHPLC format using a 50 by 3 millimeter column, 1.7 micron particle size, and we have an 85% reduction in the runtime and solvent use. But most importantly, what you can see here is the chromatography is identical to the original separation. So we've quantitatively transferred from the HPLC version, the 150 4.6 millimeter column, to the 50 by 3 millimeter column using the appropriate equations. And if we look at the critical pair in the chromatogram, that's the peaks that are most closely alluding to each other. You can see that the resolution between peaks 2 and 3 is 3.1 in the HPLC chromatogram and is 3.0 in the UHPLC chromatogram. So we have very accurately and successfully translated the chromatography. Now we actually have a free tool, it's called the ACE LC Translator tool, which is available to do these type of translations. And that is freely available to download on the MapMod website. So how can UHPLC help us with faster method development times? Well, what I'll go through here is a typical method development activity. So if we consider a 6-column, 2-solvent screening experiment. So this will be a typical method development activity where we will inject the samples on 6 different columns that have different mechanisms of interaction, and also with 2 different solvent systems, for example, methanol and acetonitrile. What is the total runtime in HPLC mode? What is the total runtime in UHPLC mode? So if we look at the sequence that we use, this is a standard sequence that many of you will use in your lab. For instance, we have there the first injection is equilibration of the column with the first solvent. We have a blank injection, then we do maybe 3 sample injections. Then we equilibrate with a second solvent, another blank injection, 3 sample injections, and then we have a wash. So if we look at the number of injections, so equilibration, samples, and washes, you can see it's described on the screen there for 1 column, and of course for when we do for 6 columns, there's 12 equilibration cycles, 48 sample cycles, and 6 column wash cycles. So if we calculate this for HPLC, so here we have a standard HPLC type separation, all of the conditions are listed on the slide. We can see that to do this total experiment of 6 columns, 2 solvents with the sequence I described would take around 57.5 hours, using just over 4 liters of solvents. If we consider a UHPLC format, so we have a 100 by 3 millimeter 2 micron column. This is the standard format that we use in our laboratory. So it's a relatively high resolution type general screening system. And we calculate the same data. We can see that we're down to 16 hours total runtime with solvent use of just over a liter. So you can see that UHPLC is offering 3.5 times faster method development time to screen those 2 key parameters, column selectivity and 2 different solvents. And also, of course, we're saving a considerable amount of solvent as well. So just to summarize, UHPLC is offering us a considerable number of advantages, whether it's for speed, for resolution, whether it's for a very high resolution, or even method development total cycle time. So UHPLC is certainly a step in the right direction for many laboratories. If we consider some practical hints and tips that are generally relevant for the analyses and for your method development and general lab practices on a daily basis, there's a couple of things that are always worth mentioning. First of all, filtering your mobile phase. This is really important. UHPLC instruments are the Ferraris of the chromatography world, and as such, we have to treat them as a high-performing instrument. So filtering your solvents and filtering your samples is really quite important. It's important to filter through the appropriate type filtration systems and the appropriate membranes. You want to make sure you're reducing any bacterial contamination, microparticulates, dusts, and fines that may be in your laboratory environment just from everyday use of the lab. And it's always important to make sure you use the appropriate type of filter systems. And of course, the quality of your solvents, the last bullet point on that slide, is also really important. And that is your organic solvents as well as the water source that you use. It's important to make sure that your mobile phase reservoirs are sealed. And this can be through using filters on the tops of the caps, as you can see on the left-hand picture. We've got there 0.45 micron syringe filters. This allows a free movement to make sure there's no pressure differential between the Duran or your container and the outside environment. And then in the center there, you have one particular product type, which is quite useful, which is what we used in our lab. And then also, it's also worth thinking about how you seal your waste containers. You don't want the volatile organics to be released into your laboratory environment. And of course, in your mobile phase Durans, you don't want ideally to lose any volatile additives, particularly for LCMS type work. Bottled water and water from different reverse osmosis type systems is really important. You need to use very high grade water. Now this was some work this was an experience we had a few years ago now, where we found we were getting very noisy peaks in our analysis, and we could not figure out where the contamination came from. What we actually came back to when we did root cause analysis and we looked at every unit operation of our analysis, we realized we actually had a batch of contaminated water. Even though this was HPLC grade, high quality water, you can see there very clearly when you filter, there was a discoloration indicating there was something either from the purification process of the water or the bottling or the container itself. So the contaminant can come from a variety of different places in your overall analytical workflow. For solvents, it's always worth using the highest grade that you can afford. If you can afford LCMS grades or far UV high quality, of course it should be at least gradient grade solvents, whether it's methanol or acetonitrile. And again, here you can see on the slide, this was some work we did a little while ago comparing different vendors and the solvents, and you can see some of the solvents really do give quite a high a response under gradient conditions, indicating potential contaminants within the actual solvents themselves. And of course, if you're doing LCMS type work, which I know many of you will be doing, then this is even more important because the MS tends to be a more sensitive detector, particularly if you're in full scan mode, then you'll start to see a variety of different components which will affect potentially the ionization of your analytes and the ionization efficiency of those analytes, but it will also affect your sensitivity, your response, and suddenly peaks can be disappearing that you normally see. And of course, that's not ideal. So what about selectivity and how can we use that in UHPLC? So this is a small bit of theory that's important for this particular section. So this is the resolution equation, and when we look at this equation we can see it has three components: an efficiency component, a selectivity component, and a retention component. And the RS here is resolution. Of course, what we're trying to do is resolve compounds from each other. This is normally the goal of why you're performing liquid chromatography. Now we can see from the graphical representation of this equation that alpha, or selectivity, is very powerful with respect to resolution on the y-axis. It's the most powerful term in this equation. So any parameters that can help us maximize selectivity are important for method development, because maximizing alpha means we're maximizing resolution of our components. Now, when you look at different factors that affect selectivity, you can see here from this slide, this is from a separate talk that I do that deals with most of these parameters in details, but I've just abbreviated it for here today. You can see that these parameters are in list format. So they go from the top of the list, such as column stationary phase, the type of organic modifier, and the pH, which are the most powerful parameters that affect alpha, down to parameters which have a smaller influence on selectivity, such as buffer selection, buffer concentration, and so on. On the right-hand side of the slide, you have gradient separations, and of course the parameters on the left are just important for gradient analysis, but we've got some other parameters specific for gradient elution chromatography there. Now, stationary phase chemistry, or more importantly, the mechanisms of interaction, are really important parameter for us to consider to maximize selectivity. So the types of chemistries that we use for our separations can really help us in our method development. Now, the types of columns that are available, there are many different types of chemistries, and we have traditional chemistries, as I've listed there. For instance, we've got C18, the most popular chemistry used across multiple application areas. We have other alkyl chains such as C8 and C4, and then we have different types of functionality, cyano and aromatic phases such as phenol. Now, with the ACE portfolio, we've designed novel chemistries that maximize selectivity by giving multiple mechanisms of interaction. So we have a C18 aromatic, we have a C18 pentafluorophenol, a polar embedded C18 amide, and so on. These chemistries have been designed specifically to give different selectivity to each other. So they should maximize the selectivity in your method development activities. This helps you resolve compounds from each other, and they're a very powerful tool for you to use in your method development. These chemistries, traditional and novel chemistries, are available in a range of different particle sizes, from UHPLC, such as 1.7, all the way through to semi-prep 10-micron format. Now, the chemistries themselves are a combination of the very popular C18 chemistry, which is very stable, highly reproducible, together with the additional functionality to give us different mechanisms of interaction. And I've just shown these structures here to highlight those novel chemistries. So we have the C18AR, the PFP, the stable cyano column, the polar embedded C18 amides, and then we have the high pH stable super C18. All of these give you an option for different selectivity regard to standard C18 for method development. So how do we use these different chemistries for our method development activities? Well, what we tend to do is these chemistries have different mechanisms of interaction, and we can quantify these mechanisms of interaction using something called the Tanaka protocol, which I've cited on this slide here. Now, this is very similar to the Snyder-Dolan hydrophobic subtraction model, which is very popular in the US. Essentially, you perform a series of experiments that allow you to understand the weighting of different mechanisms with different column chemistries. And as we can see here, for instance, if we look at C18, it is dominated by hydrophobic interactions, which of course we would expect. It's an alkyl chain that is 18 carbons long, it's lipophilic, and the main mechanism of interaction is hydrophobic interactions. You can see, of course, for a standard C18s, there's no pi system interactions because, of course, there's no aromaticity to a C18 phase. There's no dipole-dipole interactions because there's no polarizable functionality. There's a very small amount of hydrogen bonding on C18 columns. This is due to the silica surface. And then finally, many C18s have a degree of shape selectivity, and this is due to the high bonding density of the C18 chains onto the silica particle. Analytes can be discriminated on the way that they interact with those C18 chains. So C18 is the most popular phase used for many application areas. But of course, if you have other mechanisms of interaction, it helps you maximize selectivity and therefore resolution of your compounds. So the approach that we take in our lab and that we talk to many different people about is to use different column chemistries to give you different mechanisms of interaction to help you resolve the compounds of interest in your analytes. So we advocate column screening with a combination of different column chemistries and solvents as a way to explore selectivity and maximize the resolution of your compounds. So as an example, I have many examples to this, but this is one example for today. We can see here this is acetaminophen, or paracetamol as it's known here in Europe, and 9 of its related compounds, impurities, process-related impurities, and degradants. And all we've done here is we have a 6-column switcher, and we have screened, using the sequence I told you about earlier, screened these different columns with the same sample to see what the chromatography looks like. How does the retention compare to each other? How does the elution profile compare to each other? This is using methanol as a solvent. first time round, and on the next slide it uses acetonitrile. So here we can see at the top we have the C18, the AR, the PFP, the super, the polar embedded and the stable cyano, top to bottom. And what I've done is ringed in red the areas of coelution. If we count up the number of peaks that are separated from out of the 10, we can see actually that we've got two options at the bottom, the polar embedded C18 amide and the stable cyano phase of giving us 10 compounds, 10 analytes separated from each other. So from this standard screen, we can see there we have two options where we don't need to do any further method development. Now, perhaps the most important point about this slide is the fact that you can see here the standard C18, which is where 90% of analysts will have started. We have coelution of peaks 1 and 4 and 9 and 10. What would you do next? Most people would now need to start do method development, whereas if the screen had been performed, you've already got two options to move forward into optimization and validation. With the acetonitrile data, we have the same 6 columns, the same sample, the same method conditions, only using acetonitrile as the organic solvent. You can see we have the red rings again showing areas of coelution, and if we count up the peaks that are separated, with acetonitrile we actually have 4 options where we have complete separation. And again, if you combine together the number of options of separation with methanol, the number of options of separation with acetonitrile, there's actually 6 out of 12 options where we have separation of all 10 compounds from each other. Now, of course, it doesn't always work like that every single time, otherwise I'd be out of a job. There are still many examples where we need to do further method development. But the point I'm trying to explain here is I'm trying to get the column chemistry to do the work for us. I'm trying to make sure that we're using different mechanisms of interaction to maximize the selectivity of the separation. I can set this upon an instrument and I can walk away. I can let the instrument do the work. I can come back, review the data, and use that as my jump-off point for my next decisions in method development if I don't have a separation from the screen. And of course, with acetonitrile, again, you can see, even with a C18, we have a coelution between peaks 8 and 9, so some further work would be needed to give us complete separation. So moving on to the next section, sorry about that. Moving on to the next section, I'm going to talk about method translation. So this is where we have one column format. It may be a HPLC format, and we'd like to use the advantages of UHPLC, such as speed, to get us separations and analysis in a much faster time. I'll begin with isocratic translations and then move on to gradient translations. So the long and the short of the rule, the general principles for method translations is to keep a constant length to particle size ratio, L over dP. This should give you similar performance with respect to efficiency, selectivity and resolution of your separation. So if we think about that in more detail, what that means, length over particle size, for instance, is a, for example, in the USP, a typical monograph may have a 300 by 3.9 millimeter. That should be 10 micron particle size. This is approximately equivalent to a 154.6 5 micron particle size. Both values, L over dP, are 30,000. Now, in this chart that I've drawn here, you can see we have column length on the x-axis and we have particle size on the y-axis. I've simply divided one by the other in Excel. And you can see the 300 by 10 micron is 30,000. It's ringed in red. The 150 by 5 micron is 30,000. And actually 75 by 2.5 micron is also 30,000. All three of those options would give us approximately similar performance for our separations. So how do we translate the other aspects of our method? So here is a very simple process. We need to scale our injection volume for the new column format. We scale the flow rate, and there's two options there depending on if you're changing the particle size or not. And we can also approximate the new runtime, and we can approximate the back pressure of the new method as well. So what does that look like practically? Well, here we have on the top an HPLC separation of some structural isomers using a 150 by 4.65 micron column, and the method conditions are in the table at the top of the slide. And then at the bottom there we have the UHPLC translated isocratic method. And we can see the UHPLC method is in the right-hand side of the table at the top. That's been accurately translated. And if we zoom in to look at the detail, we can see that the UHPLC method gives us a very similar, almost identical resolution between different peak pairs, and you can see the performance of the method, the efficiency of the peak that I've identified there, peak 6. You can see the number of plates is very similar too. That is an accurately quantitatively transferred isocratic method, which would give us the advantage of extremely rapid analysis time compared to the original HPLC separation. And we have some nice statistics there as well, where we can see we've reduced the runtime by nearly 90%, and we've reduced the solvent consumption by around 85%. Now we have this free tool that I talked about, so you can see the isocratic screen there. I inputted the data on the previous slide to give the accurate translation. This is free to download on the MapMod website, so please do download that resource and use it, and please give us any feedback. We're always happy to listen to your experiences with the tools and the information we're providing. So what about gradient translations? Gradient translations are a little bit more complex. So we have a lot of similarity in the steps for translating a gradient. For instance, we have a calculation of column volume, which is because of making sure that the gradient sectors are the same. We have to translate the injection volume, the flow rate, and of course then we need to translate TG, which is the gradient time, to maintain a constant retention, K star in gradient analysis. And then we also need to consider the dwell volume to column volume ratio. This is particularly important when we're moving from large columns to smaller columns, and the impact of the system dwell volume on the small column volume. And I've got some nice examples to explain what I mean. So here we have a nice separation, HPLC of some peptides. Gradient analysis, there's the HPLC method listed on the screen with 6 components, and we can see the translated methods using a 50 by 3 millimeter 1.7 micron column. You can see the zoom in there, where we have the resolution between the critical pair is 3.1 in the original HPLC chromatogram and 2.8 in the UHPLC format. And we have the nice figures and values to demonstrate there a large reduction in analysis time and a large reduction in solvent consumption. Now, one of the key things about translating gradients is correcting for the dwell volume to column volume ratio. Now, here's a little bit of theory on this slide, and the reason why we need to account for this is to give us the most accurate gradient translations. This is particularly important when we have very small column volumes, such as the 50 by 3 millimeter or 50 by 2.1 millimeter column, and we're using it on a larger dwell volume system. The effect in terms of the dispersion, the dwell volume, the large dwell volume on that smaller column volume can be particularly significant for analytes that are looped quickly in the new format. So we can use a correction to our gradient table using the theory that's on the slide here. You can see we have the dwell volume, VD, and the column volume values in here. And there's also, we take into account the new flow rate as well to allow us convert the overall value to time. Now, when we do this calculation, if we get a negative value, this means we need to delay the injection by a certain amount of time after the gradient starts. So we actually inject on the gradient. If we get a positive value when we use this calculation, this means we need to inject before the gradient begins. So we're essentially introducing almost an isocratic hold to give us the same chromatography. Now this is always better illustrated with practical examples, so I'll show you some data now which helps us understand the point. So here we have a nice HPLC separation. This is a related substances separation. We have the principal component, which is peak 3, and we have impurities separated nicely using this gradient analysis. We can see resolution between peak 3 and peak 4 is 5.2. Now we can calculate the factor that we've got to use based on the column volumes and the dwell volumes of the different systems and the flow rate, and we can see here that we have to actually delay the ingredient into 0.62 minutes after the gradient started. So we're actually injecting on the gradient. We start the run, and then using an injector program, or depending on your instrument software, you can program this value in, and then the injection actually happens a certain way into the gradient. So let me show you what that looks like. So here you can see we delay the injection by 0.62 minutes, about 40 seconds or so, and then you can see here we get exactly the same chromatography on the new format. Now if we don't delay the injection, what happens? Well, you can see here we get a difference in the chromatography. We lose the resolution between the principal component and the peak 4, which is on the tail of that principal component. So sometimes the VD over VM value can be really quite influential when we're moving methods around between instruments and between different column formats. Now, luckily, all of this is taken care of in the free ACE translator tool. So all of these values and calculations are performed within the spreadsheet, which is freely downloadable on the MapMod site, including this VD over VM ratio calculation. So how do we transfer methods between different instruments? So the situation we have here is where we have developed a method, we're happy with the method, and we want to give it to our colleagues, maybe in the next lab, or maybe in a different part of the country, or maybe even a different part of the world. Maybe they're using the same instrument, maybe they're using a different instrument, a different vendor, maybe they're using a binary, you're using a quaternary system, or whatever. How do we make sure we get the most accurate method transfer? If the method is an isocratic method, then essentially there are virtually no changes required, because between different instruments there should be pretty much broadly the same chromatography achieved. The issue is when you're trying to transfer gradient methods between different platforms and there's a difference in the dwell volume. So what these next few slides discuss is how we account for the differences in dwell volume between different instruments, because of course the flow rate, the injection volume, the gradient table and gradient times, all of these things stay the same because you've developed your method and you're happy with it. So here we have an example of an isocratic transfer between two different instruments, and you can see I'm not going to go through all the details of the values. So we have two different systems here, two different UHPLCs, and you can see for the isocratic separation, the peak, the alpha, the selectivity values are very good, the retention values are very good. We would be very happy with that method transfer. That would be a good method transfer. Now, what is dwell volume? So what about gradient method transfers? Well, dwell volume is the point which I've highlighted in yellow here, at the point at which your solvents mix to the head of the column, to where the solvents enter the column. Now, on the screen at the moment is a binary system, so it has two pumps. One pump pumps mobile phase A, one pump pumps mobile phase B. Typically, binary systems have a lower dwell volume than quaternary systems. And here we have a quaternary system. Typically that has a proportioning valve, so you can see there the proportioning valve. It then has a mixer. It normally has a single pumping system which goes through then the injection system, depending on the vendor, to the head of the column. Quaternary systems typically have higher dwell volumes than binary systems. So depending on the instrument that you developed your method on and the instrument you're moving your method to, there could be quite a big difference in dwell volumes. And it's important to account for that when you're transferring a method so you get the same chromatography. Now, of course, because it's the same method, the gradient time, the flow rate, and the column itself, and therefore the column volume, of course, all stay the same. If we want to account for the dwell volume to column volume ratio, then the complicated equation I showed you earlier actually simplifies very nicely to essentially the difference in dwell volume between the different systems divided by the flow rate to give us a value in minutes, which is what we need to adjust the gradient by to give us the same chromatography. If we get a negative value, we need to delay the injection, so we actually inject onto the gradient. If we get a positive value, then we essentially introduce an isocratic hold. So what does that look like for the actual gradient table itself? So this first example is a small column on a high dwell volume system. And so the dwell volume itself is artificially too big. So what we actually do is we start the injection, start the run, the gradient table begins, but the injection actually happens a portion of time later. This then allows us to get the same separation. So this is when we have a negative value using that calculation. When we have a positive value, we actually have to inject before the gradient begins. We essentially extend the isocratic hold, and this will make sure again that we get the same selectivity and the same separation. But let me show you an example to illustrate the points. So here we have a UHPLC separation of some vanillins, and you can see I've deliberately chosen this chromatography because the peaks are looped very close to each other. And what this means is any small change in the chromatography we should see quite clearly. There's not large spaces between the peaks. So what we're going to do for this particular example is transfer the method from UHPLC instrument 1 to UHPLC instrument 2. Instrument 1 is a quaternary system, so it will have a high dwell volume. Instrument 2 is a binary system, so it will have a lower dwell volume. You can see I've actually included the calculation on the screen. So the instrument 1, the quaternary, has a dwell volume of 574 microliters, and instrument 2, the binary, has a dwell volume of 202 microliters. So we calculate the value, and you can see that when we calculate and divide through, it indicates a positive value, 0.29 minutes. This means that we actually have to introduce a slight isocratic hold to the analysis to give us the same separation. So what does that look like practically? Well, here we have the original separation, UHPLC separation at the top, and if we don't introduce the isocratic hold from the calculation, you can see the chromatography on instrument 2 is different. You can see we've lost the resolution between the peaks. It's gone from 1.7 to 1.0. There are differences in the chromatography. If we were transferring this method, this would not be acceptable, of course. If we introduce the isocratic hold from the calculation into the gradient table, you can see on the same instrument, UHPLC instrument 2, with that small adjustment, by essentially injecting early before the gradient starts, we actually get the chromatography almost identical to what it was on the original instruments. So we've accounted for the VD/VM ratio, and it's given us a very accurate transfer of that method. So the selectivity is restored. And all of this is included in the Method Transfer tab in the free-to-download ACE Transfer and Translation tool. So please do have a look at that and see what you think and let us know. So if we take that original vanillin separation, which is in the middle here, you can see the original method. We can transfer this to the same type of instrument, the same vendor instrument, but this is the difference between the original methods on a quaternary, and this is now on a binary system. And then we can actually change vendor. So now this is a different UHPLC instrument with a different dwell volume, and you can see we get exactly the same separation again. And then we've actually got a third different UHPLC vendor instrument here, and now we get exactly the same chromatography again. So we've got two different types of instrument here, a binary and a quaternary, and three different vendors. And you can see this very close chromatography has been quantitatively transferred between all of those different platforms. So just to bring that all together and finish up the presentation just about on time with a little bit of time for Q&A, hopefully what you've heard today is that UHPLC can provide us some benefits. We can enjoy the speed of UHPLC, we can enjoy the increased resolution, and we can even perform these high resolution separations with column coupling using the equations that I showed you to get the same selectivity but with much higher resolution values and peak capacity values. I talked a bit about stationary phase selectivity, using those different mechanisms of interaction to maximize selectivity, which will maximize the resolution between our analytes. And of course, that's not exclusive for UHPLC. From a selectivity perspective, that concept holds also for HPLC. I talked about the different novel chemistries that we've designed to give multiple modes of interaction. These help us maximize selectivity and therefore resolution. They are excellent choices for method development. I talked a bit about translation of methods, where we move methods between different column formats. And for isocratic analysis, it's straightforward. For gradient, we've got to consider the gradient time translation, and also, of course, correct for the dwell volume between different instruments. And that's particularly important between quaternary instruments and binary instruments, and also between different vendor instruments, because of course the dwell volumes due to the different engineering are likely to be different. I talked about how we can transfer methods between different instruments as well, and how we can do that quantitatively if we use some of the guidance that I've described in this talk and some of the equations I've also described in this talk. And I've highlighted the use of this translator tool, which you can use yourself to plug your different values in, and it will do translation and transfer for you automatically. And we've now had this available for quite a long time. We did an extensive beta test, and it gives very, very accurate quantitative values, and it's free to download. There's a whole host of other useful resources as well, things that I've touched on within the presentation. So if we start at the top, we've got the translation tool and the help file that goes with it. We've got a series of knowledge notes. So for instance, if you're sat there thinking, well, I don't know what my dwell volume is, how can I determine it so that I can use it for these calculations? We've got a very nice knowledge note which tells you in very simple terms how to determine your system dwell volume for gradient analysis. We've got a couple of other nice knowledge notes in there. For instance, we've got one on determining extra column dispersion and extra column volume. We've got one on gradient method translation as well. And then moving down, we've got a very nice brochure on method development and describing different kits and formats, particularly for the novel chemistries that are available. And all of these resources are available for you to download at mac-mod.com. Or you can email the guys at MacMod, info@mac-mod.com, and they'll be able to help you with any questions or queries that you have. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening today. I hope you found it useful. But before you go, I have a couple of polls which I'd like to run. So this first poll here, if you could please just click one of the boxes here and press submit. This is useful for us because it helps us understand a little bit more about the type of challenges that you are facing in your labs, about the things that interest you, and helps us tailor the content to make sure we're talking about the relevant subjects that you want to hear about that help you with your challenges in your lab every single day. So I'm just going to leave that on the screen just for a few moments more, so that you can please click one of the radio buttons and then click submit, so that we can understand what interests you. That's the first poll. There's only one more poll, and then we'll be able to wrap up the webinar. So the second poll, if you could please also click one of the two buttons, to give us some feedback on the webinar. I covered a number of different topics today, quite a few different topics, 4 or 5 quite meaty topics that I mashed together into this talk. I touched on them just to give you a flavor of some of the ways I think that you could use some of this information to help you in your analysis day to day in your lab, some of the tools that are available, some of the concepts and things to think about, selectivity and so on. That would be great if you could please click one of those buttons. It really helps us. We want to make sure that we're talking about the topics that you want to hear about, answering the questions that you have in your lab with your analysis. That's the best way that we can help you with the things that you deal with every day. So with that, I'm going to leave this last poll just here for a few moments longer. I'm now going to be quiet and pass back to the moderator so that we can begin the Q&A section. So thank you again for listening. I hope you have a great afternoon, and we'll start to work through the questions in a moment or two. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Stu Borman back here, and we do have a few questions. The first question for you, Alan, is do you have any UHPLC solutions for peptides or proteins?
Hello. So one of the examples I showed was a peptide separation, a simple peptide separation using a C18 column, but you can also do something similar on some of the novel chemistries, the AR and the PFP as well. We have those available in UHPLC formats, 1.7 micron, 2 micron, and also HPLC 3 and 5 as well. Protein and analysis, we have a 300 angstrom particle, but the smallest particle size we go to is 3 micron. That tend to be what we found that is most popular with a lot of our customers. But again, we do a C4 type chemistry for sort of larger proteins, larger than 8 kilodaltons, for instance. That's probably the most appropriate type of stationary phase to use in that type of protein analysis.
Thank you. Do UHPLC columns need to be replaced more often due to higher pressure in these systems compared to normal HPLC?
In my experience, no. It's interesting because I think it's a perception. The thing is about UHPLC columns is you have to think, if possible, in column volume and not in time. The number of column volumes between HPLC and UHPLC, we design and manufacture our columns to give at least 20,000 column volumes performance. Now that can be 1,000 injections or 2,000 injections depending on your runtime. What you've got to remember is you typically do more sample analysis, more throughput of samples with UHPLC because of the reduced runtime. So if you have an HPLC column that lasts a month and your UHPLC column lasts only 2 weeks, what you've got to do is not think of it in terms of time, but think of the number of columns, number of column volumes, and the number of samples that you've analyzed through that column, because they should be the same, at least the same, if not better. But you can't think of it just in terms of time, because you may have done 10,000 samples in a month with HPLC, but you might do 10,000 samples in 2 weeks with UHPLC because the column volume is small and the analysis time is so much less. So you need to think of it in terms of column volumes. But no, to answer the question directly, UHPLC columns should not last less time than HPLC columns.
Okay, and can UHPLC columns be used in normal HPLC systems?
Can. So it depends on your instruments. Obviously, you're going to have pressure limitations. If you're using a longer column with small particles, then just straight out the box, you could be 500, 600, 700 bar easily. And obviously, most HPLCs or older HPLCs have a maximum pressure of 400 bar. Many HPLCs nowadays have a pressure of 600 bar as a minimum, but you could easily still go above that. There are lots of examples, and we have lots of examples where we're doing separations on 30 millimeter length columns, the 3 centimeter columns, and 50 millimeter or 5 centimeter length columns with 1.7 and 2 micron particles. You can, depending on your gradient conditions, use this on, for instance, maybe a 400 bar and certainly a 600 bar instrument, but it really does depend on your mobile phase and on your system, the type of this instrument you have.
Okay, thanks. And another question, will adding an external mixer to a UHPLC system reduce noise for gradient analysis? It
can do. I mean, many of the way that UHPLC instruments are designed nowadays is typically the ripple, which is what is measured in lots of performance qualification of instruments, is typically very good. It's very low on most of the UHPLC instruments. I'm assuming you're talking, this question's about LCUV as well, as opposed to something like LCMS. The issue so yes, it can do, but a lot of times I haven't come across examples where there's been a very noisy baseline requiring further dampening, if you like, which is what this extra mixer would do. The only thing you've got to remember with an extra mixer is you're adding extra volume depending on where you put it in your flow path. So you need to make sure that you account for that if you're doing gradient analysis or you're developing methods for somebody else and then giving them your methods, because that will have an effect on the chromatography of the system that's receiving the method, because the dwell volumes are unlikely to be the same. So yes, it can smooth out if you really do need it even smoother. I haven't come across many examples. Most of the engineering for UHPLC is very, very good, so the ripple is very low. But if you do need to use it, you need to use it. Just be aware of the potential extra volume introduction implications.
Okay, I have a question here. What is the suggested maximum injection volume on a 1.7 micrometer column, 50 millimeters, 2.1 millimeter diameter?
I mean, the general rules of thumb are, again, it's related to your column volume. So there are equations out there to help you calculate this, depending on the type of media, the type of silica particles that you're using, the surface area, it's relating to loading and so on. As a general rule of thumb, lots of people say that you shouldn't go above around about 4% or so of your column volume. So whatever the column volume is for that type of particle or the type of particle you're thinking about, depends on the calculation that you do, depending on the column porosity. It needs to be around 3, 4, 5% maximum of the column volume. That's a general rule of thumb.
Thanks. And I have very polar compounds. Do the ACE columns offer solutions to chromatograph these compounds?
Yes. So in particular, the C18 PFP, the C18 amide, are designed for the retention of polar compounds, moderately polar compounds to reasonably polar compounds. I would certainly recommend those type of chemistries would be very, very useful as opposed to a standard C18.
Okay, thank you. That's all the time we have. Thanks to Alan McCune for your presentation today. Thank you, participants, for joining us today. Be sure to check CNEN online or the print version of CNEN for information on upcoming editions of CNEN webinars. Thanks to On24 for technology and production services, and thanks to MacMod Analytical for the sponsorship that made this interactive webcast possible. For CNEN webinars, I'm Stu Borman. Goodbye for now. Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Stu Borman, Contributing Senior Editor at CNEN Media Group, and I will be moderating today's event. This webinar on practical UHPLC, selectivity and rapid method development, method translations, and UHPLC instrument transfer